I've told this story maybe 4 times in my whole life, never to a camera, but people keep getting it wrong when they pass it around, so let me set it straight from the man who was actually there. I was the radio operator. I'm the one who heard her go quiet, and I'm the one who heard her come back. Her name was Myra Halden, scout marksman, 26 years old and the calmest person I ever served beside. That's the part nobody believes when they hear the rest. This was up on Tallow Ridge. If you've never been to that part of the mountains, picture this. Cold that gets into your teeth. Pines so thick that at noon it still feels like dusk under them. And below the ridge, a valley town called Brevin, maybe 900 people, a church with a crooked steeple and a single road in and out. That road was the whole point. Everybody wanted it. We were the ones told to hold the high ground above it so the other side couldn't roll down into the valley. It was late autumn, first snow hadn't come yet, but you could smell it, that metal smell in the air, the kind that makes old men's knees ache. There were 11 of us up there. I won't pretend we were heroes. We were tired men and one tired woman low on everything, told to sit on a frozen ridge and wait. Our sergeant was a man named Cole Brandt. I want to be fair to him even now. Brandt wasn't evil. He was scared. There's a difference, and the difference is exactly what this story is about. Myra used to take the forward position. Alone, mostly. She'd crawl out past our line to a notch in the rocks where she could see the whole approach, and she'd lie there for hours, completely still, breathing slow. She had this rifle she'd carried for years, old thing, scratch stock. She called it nothing fancy, just the long one. She cleaned it every single night, even when her fingers were too stiff to feel the cloth. I'd watch her do it by the light of a little stove and think, that woman trusts that rifle more than she trusts any of us. Turns out she was right too. It happened on a gray morning, maybe a week into our time up there. Myra was out at the forward notch, I was at the radio. The rest were strung along the ridge behind cover, and then the trees on the far slope just came alive. They'd worked around us in the night, climbed a route we thought was impossible. They came at the forward position first, which meant they came at Myra first. I remember her voice on the radio, flat as a table. Contact, west slope, a lot of them. Not panic, just information. And then everything went loud at once. I won't walk you through every second. War isn't a clean thing you can lay out neat. It's noise and smoke and men shouting names. What matters is this. Myra held that forward notch alone for almost 20 minutes. 20 minutes. She broke up their first push, then their second. She bought us time we did not deserve, because while she was buying it, behind her, Sergeant Brandt was already deciding we should leave. I heard it on the radio. Her calling for someone to swing wide and cover her left so she could pull back to our line. A simple thing. 2 men, 30 seconds of fire, and she'd have made it home. I looked at Brandt. He had the handset half up to his mouth, and I watched him not press the button. "Sergeant," I said, "she's asking for cover, she can break contact." He didn't look at me. He looked down the ridge toward the road and the dark trees, and he said, quiet like he was talking to himself, "We can't hold this. We move now or we all die here." "She can make it back," I said, "she just needs." "There's no time." I want you to understand how fast a thing like that happens. It isn't a long, dramatic decision with music behind it. It's a man making the worst choice of his life in about 4 seconds because he's frightened and cold and he wants to see his kids again. He gave the order, "Fall back, east trail, now," and 10 of us got up and ran, and one of us was still out in the rocks asking for help that was never coming. I keyed the radio one last time before we broke. I shouldn't have. The order was to stay silent, but I did it anyway. "Myra, we're moving east, pull back if you can." That was all I was allowed to say. That was all I could do. There was a pause, a long one, then her voice came back, and it wasn't angry, and that's the thing that has haunted me for years. She wasn't angry, she just understood all at once exactly what was happening to her. "Copy," she said, "go." One word for us, one word for herself. Go. And then the radio went dead and we ran down the east trail in the cold with our heads down, and behind us the gunfire kept on for a while and then it stopped, and the silence after it was worse than any sound I've ever heard. We made it to the valley by dark. 11 went up the ridge, 10 came down. Brandt filed the report himself. I read it later. He wrote that Corporal Halden was overrun at the forward position and presumed killed in action, that recovery was impossible under enemy pressure. Every word of it technically true. And every word of it a lie, because it left out the 4 seconds where a man chose not to press a button. They held a small thing for her 3 days later. No body, so it was just a name read out and a moment of quiet. Brandt stood at the front with his cap in his hands and his jaw tight, and I stood at the back and I couldn't look at him. The other men couldn't either. Nobody said the real thing out loud, but we all knew, you can't share a secret like that and ever really look at each other again. I told myself she was gone. It was the only thing that made the running survivable. If she was dead, then leaving her was a tragedy, and tragedies you can live with. It's the other word you can't carry. Abandoned. That one has teeth. So we sat in Brevin and we held the road from below, and the snow finally came, real snow, and the valley went white and the ridge above us turned into a wall of fog. Weeks went by. The town fed us what little it had. There was an old woman near the church who'd make a pot of something hot every evening and leave it on her step for whichever of us was on watch, and she never once asked our names. She'd just nod. I think she knew soldiers don't want to be known when they're ashamed. And all that time, up on the ridge in the snow and the cold and the dark, something none of us imagined was happening. She wasn't dead. I'll tell you how I know, because I heard it from her own mouth later, in the slow, careful way she had of telling things, leaving out the parts that hurt and somehow making them louder for the leaving out. She'd been hit, not badly enough to kill her, badly enough to drop her. A round through the meat of the left thigh and another that creased her side. When she went down behind the rocks, she had the presence of mind to go still and quiet, and the men coming up the slope, they were in a hurry. They had the road in their eyes. They didn't stop to check a body that wasn't moving. They went past her, right past. One of them, she said, stepped on the edge of her coat in the snow and didn't even glance down. So they thought she was dead too. Both sides agreed on that point. The only one who disagreed was Myra. She lay there until full dark, bleeding, freezing, listening to the fight move down toward the valley and then fade. And here is the part I think about most. She told me she was not afraid in that moment. She was something else. She said she felt her whole life narrow down to a single thin thread, and the thread was this: get up, don't die in the snow where they left you, get up. She bound the leg with a strip torn from her own shirt. She found her rifle, which had fallen just out of reach, and she dragged herself to it through the snow on her elbows because she couldn't put weight on the leg, and when her hand closed around that scratched old stock, she said something in her broke loose and steadied at the same time. Like the rifle was the one piece of the world that hadn't lied to her. And then, alone, shot twice in the dark in the first real snow of the year on a ridge everyone had written off, Myra Halden started to crawl. Not down to the valley, that's what you'd expect. Down toward us, toward warmth and help in the road. No, she crawled the other way first, east and up into the deep timber away from everyone. Because she was smart and she knew the slope below was crawling with the men who'd just taken it, and a wounded soldier moving slow downhill into that was a wounded soldier who'd be dead by morning. So she went up into the trees to live, and the living took her 31 days. I want to slow down here because the easy version of this story skips straight from they left her to she came back with a rifle, like the middle was nothing. The middle was everything. The middle is where the woman they buried in a report turned into something none of us were ready for. 31 days in the high timber in early winter. She didn't tell it like a hero's tale. She told it like chores. That's the only way I can describe it. Other people would have made it dramatic. Myra made it sound like a list of small, stubborn tasks she did one after another so she wouldn't have time to lie down and quit. The first 3 days were the worst, she said. The leg swelled up bad and she couldn't tell if it was going to turn on her, the way wounds do in the cold when they go green and sour. There's a kind of fever that comes with that, and she had it off and on. She'd crawl into the lee of a fallen pine, pack the wound with snow to bring the swelling down, and shake until the shaking passed. She ate snow for water. For food, the first while, she had nothing. 2 days, nothing. Then she found a dead bird under a tree, frozen, and she made herself eat it. And she said that was the meal that turned her, because after you've done a thing like that, you stop arguing with yourself about what survival costs. She learned the mountain like it was a job, where the wind cut and where it didn't, which hollows held the cold and which held a little warmth. She found an old hunter's lean-to, half collapsed on the 4th or 5th day, and that became home. She propped it back up with her good shoulder and a lot of swearing, she said, and that night was the first night she slept more than an hour. The leg somehow didn't turn. The cold that was trying to kill her was also the thing that kept the wound from going bad. She kept it clean with snow and bound it fresh every morning with strips she boiled in a tin can over the smallest fire she could manage, because she'd learned to fear smoke more than she feared the cold. A column of smoke is a flag that says, "Here I am." So she burned only dry, dead wood that gives no smoke, and only at night, and only in a pit she dug so the light wouldn't carry. Everything she did to not be seen. She set snares. She wasn't a hunter by trade, but she'd read about it once and she figured the rest out the hard way with a lot of empty mornings. The first thing she caught was a hare, and she said she sat there holding it and cried for the first time in the whole ordeal, not from sadness, from something closer to gratitude, the animal kind of gratitude that doesn't have words. And every night, no matter how bad the day had been, she cleaned the rifle. I asked her once why. The rifle wasn't doing anything up there. She had a few rounds and nothing to shoot at but the occasional snare miss. Why clean it every night? She looked at me for a second and then she said, because it was the one promise I could keep. I've never forgotten that, the one promise I could keep. Everything else had broken. Her unit had broken faith with her. Her body was barely holding. The world had decided she was a name on a report. But that rifle she could keep clean and oiled and ready, and as long as she could do that one thing right, then she was still a soldier, and a soldier isn't someone you abandon. A soldier is someone who's coming back. Now here's the thing about Tallow Ridge that I haven't told you yet, and it's the thing that turned her survival into a plan. From the high timber where she was holed up, she could see down the far slope. And what she could see was that the men who'd taken the ridge weren't sitting still. They were building, bringing up supplies on the goat trails a few at a time so as not to be obvious, stockpiling, and she was close enough with that old rifle scope to watch them and count them and understand what we down in the valley could not see from below. They were getting ready to come down the road into Brevin, not raid it, take it, the whole valley, and they were going to do it soon before the deep snow closed the high passes and locked everyone in place for the winter. We had no idea. We were sitting in the town congratulating ourselves on holding the road from below, never knowing the hammer was being raised above our heads. The only person in the whole world who could see it coming was a woman we'd left for dead. Think about what that means for a second. She had every reason to do nothing. She owed us nothing. We had abandoned her in the snow. The cleanest, most human thing she could have done was wait for the high passes to half open, slip out east and go home and let the men who left her get exactly what their cowardice earned. Nobody on earth would have blamed her. I wouldn't have. I don't think God would have. But she didn't think that way. I asked her much later why she didn't just leave. Why come back to a town full of people who'd written her off to warn and protect the very unit that ran? She was quiet a long time, then she said, because the town didn't leave me, Brant did, and the town doesn't deserve to burn for what one frightened man decided in 4 seconds. The town didn't leave me. That was the whole compass of her. She could separate the 900 innocent people in Brevin from the one man who'd failed her. Most of us, when we're hurt, we want the whole world to pay. She only wanted the right thing to happen. That's a kind of strength I don't have words big enough for. So she made a plan alone in a falling down lean-to, on a wounded leg with an old rifle and not enough bullets. She couldn't fight them. One person against that many is not a battle, it's a suicide. But she'd spent weeks watching them and she understood something about the ground that they didn't because they were occupiers and she was a scout who'd lived in those trees like an animal. There was only one trail wide enough to bring their stockpile down to the road. One. It ran through a narrow cut between 2 rock shoulders, a place where the mountain pinched tight. If you wanted to move men and supplies from the ridge to the valley, you went through that cut, or you went nowhere. And one person, well-placed with a clear line and a cool head, could hold a cut like that for a long time. Long enough, maybe, to change everything. She started moving on the 29th day, down out of the high timber, slow by night, the leg better now but never going to be right again, dragging a little. She cached herself above the cut on the 30th day and watched, and what she saw confirmed it. They were nearly ready. 1 more day, 2 at most, and they'd start the push. On the night of the 31st day, Myra Halden settled into a notch above the narrow cut, the same way she'd settled into that forward position 5 weeks before. Still, breathing slow, rifle cleaned and ready, the one promise she'd kept. And down in the valley, we slept, having no idea that the dead had come down off the mountain to stand between us and the end of everything. I was on watch that night as it happens, cold so hard the air felt like glass. I remember looking up at the black wall of the ridge and the snow ghosting across it and thinking, like I did most nights, the same useless thought, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I didn't know she could practically hear me. I didn't know she was up there in the dark, 3,000 feet above my head, finally, after 31 days, close enough to come home. It started before dawn. The first I knew of anything was the sound. You learn the difference after enough time between distant thunder and distant fire, and this was fire. Up high, single-spaced shots, not a firefight, not the roar of 2 sides at each other. Just one rifle, fired slow and deliberate with long gaps between, the way a person shoots when they have to make every round count because they don't have many. I came off the wall yelling and the whole town came awake at once. Brant was out in the street in his undershirt with his boots half on, staring up at the ridge, and the look on his face is something I'll carry to my grave because he knew, before any of us he knew, there was only one person who shot like that. Slow, spaced, certain. "That's not possible," he said. He said it twice. "That's not possible." Up at the cut, this is what was happening, and I pieced it together later from her and from the prisoners we took. They'd started their push down the trail in the dark, just as she'd guessed, a long line of men and mules loaded with everything they'd been stockpiling for weeks. They came into the narrow cut single file because there was no other way, packed tight between the two rock shoulders, and that's exactly where she wanted them. She didn't fire into the crowd. She wasn't a butcher and she wasn't suicidal. She fired at the front. One man, the lead, dropped and the whole column behind him jammed up against the rock with nowhere to go, and panic moves through a packed line like fire through dry grass. They couldn't see her. The shots came from above and ahead, from the gray nowhere of the rocks, slow and patient and impossible to locate. Every time someone tried to push forward through the cut, she took him. Every time they tried to climb the shoulder to flank, the ground forced them into the open and she took them there too. She made that narrow cut a door and she stood in it. For 2 hours, on a wounded leg with a count of bullets she could hold in 2 hands against a force that should have rolled over her in minutes. The reason they didn't is the reason this story exists. They couldn't believe it was one person. Nobody holds a cut like that alone. So they fought it like there was a platoon up in those rocks, slow and careful and frightened, and the slowness was exactly what she was selling them. Every minute she bought was a minute the alarm spread, a minute the valley woke, a minute the thing they'd planned for weeks fell apart in the cold. And down below, after the first shock, Brant did the one thing in this whole story that let me forgive him a little before the end. He went up. He grabbed his rifle and he started up the ridge alone, and the rest of us looked at each other for about 1 second and then we went after him, because whatever was happening up there, we were not going to be the men who stayed in the valley twice. We climbed that ridge in the dark with our lungs on fire and the single slow shots calling us up like a bell, and somewhere in the climb I understood, the way you understand a thing all at once in your whole body, who was shooting. We came up over the rim into the gray first light, and there was the cut, and there was the jammed and broken column already starting to fall apart and flee back up the trail, and there, in a notch in the rocks above it, was a figure I didn't recognize at first. Thin to the bone, wrapped in rags and a filthy coat, hair like something wild. And then she turned her head and looked down the slope at us coming up, and it was her face. It was Myra's face, gaunt and burned by wind and absolutely calm. And I heard Brant make a sound next to me that I have never heard a grown man make before or since. She didn't shoot at him. I think part of him expected her to. He'd have stood there and let her, I believe that. But she just looked at him, and then she looked past him at the rest of us, at the unit that ran, climbing the ridge to finally do the thing we should have done 5 weeks before. And she said one word loud enough to carry, the same word she'd said the day we left her, except now it meant the opposite. Go. Go, finish it. And we did. We came up on her flanks, and the fight that had been one exhausted woman became a real defense, and the column broke for good and ran, and the push that would have taken the valley died in that narrow cut with the snow coming down on it. When it was over, the silence came back, the same silence as the day we'd left her, and we stood in it not knowing what to do with ourselves. Myra tried to stand, and the leg wouldn't have it. And she sat back down in the snow with the rifle across her knees, and she was so tired she could barely lift her head. I got to her first. I got my arm under her and I was saying something, I don't even know what, sorry, probably, sorry, the only prayer I'd had for 5 weeks. And she put her hand on my arm to quiet me. Her hand was like ice. You came back this time, she said, that's all, no bitterness in it, just a plain fact, almost gentle, you came back this time. Brant came up slow. He got down on his knees in front of her in the snow and he couldn't speak. This big frightened man who'd made the worst choice of his life in 4 seconds, on his knees in front of the proof that the choice had been a lie. She looked at him for a long moment. The whole unit held its breath. And then she said the thing that I think was harder and braver than the entire 31 days on the mountain. She said, I'm not going to tell anyone what you did, but you're going to. And he did, later down in the valley when the medics had her and the leg was being saved and the town was crowding around her like she was something holy. Brant stood up in front of all of them and told the truth. The real report. The 4 seconds, the button he didn't press. He told it with his voice shaking and his hands shaking, and he didn't leave out a single shameful word, because she'd asked him to, and because I think telling it was the only way he had left to climb back toward being a man. She let him keep his name clean to the higher-ups in the end. Made me change the official record only to say she'd survived and rejoined and held the cut. The 4 seconds stayed between the people on that ridge. That was her choice, and I never understood it fully, except that she seemed to think shame is a thing a man has to carry himself in private where it can actually change him, and that nailing it up in public just turns it into theater. She wasn't interested in theater. She was only ever interested in the right thing happening. The leg never came fully back. She walked with a stick after that, and she left the service that spring, and she went somewhere quiet, and we lost touch the way you do. I saw her once more years on in a market town far from those mountains. She was older and the wildness was gone out of her face, and she had a kid by the hand, somebody's I assumed, maybe her own, I didn't ask. She saw me and she smiled, and we talked about nothing for 10 minutes, the weather, the price of things, and neither of us said one word about the ridge. But when she turned to go, she stopped and she looked back at me and she said, "You still on the radio in your dreams?" And I said yes, because I am. I still hear myself key that handset and say go, and I still hear her say it back, one word for us and one word for herself. People ask me what the lesson is. I don't think it's about bravery, really. Plenty of brave people would have come down off that mountain swinging for revenge, and I'd have understood it. The thing about Myra wasn't that she was fearless. It was that she could be the most wronged person on the whole mountain and still come back down it carrying the right thing instead of the bitter thing. They left her in the snow. She had every reason to let the valley burn. And instead she cleaned an old rifle every night for 31 days just to keep one promise to herself, and then she walked back into the path of the people who'd failed her, and she stood in the door and she held it. They abandoned her to die. She came back to make sure the rest of us could live, and the only thing she ever asked in return was the truth. That's the story. I've told it right this time, now you tell it right too.